course of history is really something indescribable. Anything that happens, a bad night, not only of a very important and influential man, but of anybody, is part of history. Even what happens to a fly is part of the historical process, of human historical process, because it may, of course, especially if it sets a fly, it may have rather important influence. The point is really that we have to distinguish, let us say, the historical processes which are infinitely complex and infinitely elaborate. Then we have to distinguish the writing of history. And that is what one calls historiography. There is this strange aspect of history that we cannot write just history. We have to write history of something. And there is another important thing, and that is that if we have no problems, history wouldn't be very interesting. And problems are problems to explain.
Yes, of course, every historian who has ever done what is called historical research knows that when he goes into an archive or a public records office, he cannot possibly read all the millions of documents there. His research is really a search for an answer to a question, whether it is when a certain picture was painted or how many ships arrived at a certain port from the Far East, or, as you say, more importantly, how certain things developed and became what they are now. It is often said, of course, that school children should not only learn the sequence of kings and of battles, but those who say so, they often mean that they should only be taught the history of the class struggle. Now, I wouldn't deny that the history of exploitation and the fight against exploitation is also an interesting topic of the kind you alluded to. But I think it would be very important if at school children would learn. There was a book by Haldane called Everything Has a History, would learn that one can be curious about how anything arose in our lives, and often the question leads us to very surprising and interesting answers.
I think there are no historical laws, but there are situations which more or less, certain aspects, of course, repeat themselves. If we want to explain something in history, we have to take these typical situations, make as it were a kind of model of them, and use then this model in order to explain certain events. So, for example, the model of availability of books leads in essence, it seems, to democracy, and a similar consequence, more complicated, we find in the Renaissance. Our own time, our Western democracy, may be said to be very largely a consequence of the printing press, if one thinks it through. There are quite a number of examples of such historical explanation which explain things, of course, only conjecturally, which at first seem almost inexplicable.
You have spoken in this context of the logic of situation.
Yes, that is
and
it.
That
really
is a very valuable
the
idea.
Logic of situation. The logic of situation, I mean that we analyze a situation in such a way that the actions of the people in that situation are then simply the optimal actions which these people in their own interest can take. I would, however, say that it does belong also to the logic of the situation that people in acting make mistakes. Mistakes are unavoidable and can be, although in a way they are illogical, but they can be incorporated in the logic of the situation. The problem of democracy is the avoidance of tyranny, and it is a great problem because of the popular leader. There may be a popular leader, he may have democratic backing, and with democratic backing, as it were, with the legitimacy of the people, he may become a tyrant. We have that in Greece, it is described by Plato as typical, and we have it again in the English Revolution, and we have it again under Hitler, just to give a few such very characteristic cases. And for this reason, I believe that it is important that democracy, even though it is translated as rule of the people, should be interpreted not as a popular rule, because the people may authorize a tyrant, but as that kind of structure where the people have the power to dismiss the government, to get rid of the government. So I have not only now spoken about history, but actually about politics, but these two are closely related.
What you just said about democracy having to do with an effort to prevent tyranny, again applies particularly well to the story of Florence in the 14th and 15th century. The Florentines were so anxious to prevent tyranny by preventing anybody from ruling alone, that they introduced a very complicated system of elections to offices, each of which should not last longer than sometimes 2 months or 4 months. And this very complicated system of elections, of course, was stultifying. One might say that it led to Medici rule as an unintended consequence, because it wasn't workable unless some people really maintained the continuity, and also the continuity of power in foreign politics and in other matters. So that here you have an example of the error which you mentioned before, which can creep into a situation if it isn't possibly properly thought through, or even if it is thought through. So this your logic of situation doesn't mean, as I understand it, that the logic is compelling in the sense of determinism.
Now, historical determinism is something which has grown out of natural determinism, of the idea that there are natural laws which determine completely what happens. Similar then, there are historical laws which determine what happens. But while I think there are natural laws, even though not really deterministic natural laws, I think there are hardly anything like historical laws. The whole idea of determinism goes, of course, again back to the gods who determine what happens in our world. From here it is then taken over with the development of science, where instead of the gods, the natural law explain everything. And then with the evolution of history and of historicism arises the idea that historical law determine and explain everything. But I think that this is a false dogma, one of the many false dogmas which have played a role in historiography.
Perhaps we might say that there is another false dogma which is particularly popular today, which I might refer to as relativism in history. It has to do with your idea about the logic of situations. It denies, in a way, that we can ever explain or understand another period or another culture, because all the presuppositions are so different, and the context of every statement is so different, that we will never understand, let us say, something said in ancient Greece or anywhere, or in Florence or anywhere else, because the framework within which these statements are made is so different that we cannot reconstruct it ever. You have written in this context, in an article of which I am very fond, that this doctrine confuses a great difficulty with an impossibility.
It arises from the modest realization that we haven't really quite understood yet. But this should not lead to a nihilistic attitude. It cannot be understood, but only to realizing that our task is very difficult, in our task in understanding, and that a lot of work should go in, a lot of thought should go in, and a lot of imagination has to go in. Obviously, anybody may say, how do you know that you are so successful? You may only imagine that you are so successful. Nevertheless, in this way of historical search and research, we do discover more and more facts, and the facts do fit better and better together into a picture.
Yes, there are, of course, models of tremendous successes in historical research, like the deciphering of some ancient scripts, which we can now read, and though we may not understand them completely, we certainly understand them better than before it was possible to read them at all.
That is really, we cannot answer relativism by saying we know now definitely, dogmatically. we have it all in our pocket now, but we can answer relativism by the claim that we have made definite progress.
Right.
That is possible.
Of course, without the imagination, without speculation, no historian can get anywhere. All that we would have left is a list of facts and dates which may also be wrong. And in so far, I quite agree with you that there must be an ingredient in any historical work of imagination, of construction, of hypotheses, and that goes not only for more immediate situations, but also for the development of the human race, if you like. You have written a good deal about the dangers of psychological explanation in the logic of situation, but you have also used certain psychological elements in some of your writings, and one of them is the sense of drift caused by the absence of a closed society, which you discussed in your book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. The idea that the freedom of the open society also causes a kind of psychological reaction, a longing for the shelter of the tribal closed society, as you called it.
Yeah.
We cannot, I think, quite get away from this kind of explanation, nor would you want to, I believe. It interests me very much because I have also, in the context of explanations, used certain psychological facts or factors. For instance, the difficulty of learning to represent the world accurately if you haven't learned it. This is part of the theme of my book on art and illusion, that you can only do this by trial and error and learning from your predecessors.
And from your mistakes.
And from your, trial and error, of course. This is, I think, a very important point, because it does not contradict the logic of the situation. It's part of the logic of the situation, that we are just so made that we can't simply make a tracing of the view outside without attempting to interpret it, to learn about it, etc. So that in this and in other respects, I think, the logic of situation should not be misinterpreted as claiming that people are always logical. If somebody, for instance, doesn't want to start a business on Friday the 13th because he thinks it's a day of ill omen, he is perfectly logical or rational in not starting a business because that is his belief. And in many interpretations of situations, we find these beliefs playing a great role. Mastery of a skill is, of course, something which interests me very much because it's part of art and of the history of art. Bach didn't have to think very much when he wrote the fugue. I mean, he knew exactly how to do it. Of course, he was exploring, but within a given field which he knew perfectly well. That is to say, it's very different for Bach to write a fugue as it is for me or you to write a fugue. I know you have written fugues, but even so, that is a very different thing. The degree of mastery, which starts on a certain platform, as it were, which makes it possible to make fresh discoveries and fresh explorations.
I completely agree with you that we explore the world, we obtain knowledge up to a certain level, and starting on this new level, we have a new starting point and so on. I completely agree with that. But I would say this again is a kind of trial and error working, and not really the repetition which leads to forgetfulness, that is to say, to automatization, to banning it from our consciousness.
But it is a very important point, you see, let us say in modern art teaching, that everybody should just fool around as they like, and not learn the mastery of the masters.
Yes.
And in that respect, they have to learn in a very disciplined way.
Yes. I completely agree with you. I have often formulated it by saying, if we start from Adam, we won't get any further than Adam did.
Quite. We should perhaps say here what bearing this has on history. It has because it throws light on the continuities, both in the history of science and in the history of art, that there's always a platform from which the next apprentice starts.
This is very important, and this continuity should not be interrupted. And this continuity should also be understood as a part of problem solving. It is within problem solving there are also solved problems.
Yes.
And then we go on to new problem solving.
That's
we
right.
have solved problems and go on to new problems, and the new problems can only be solved by trial, error, and of course in art especially by evaluation.
Quite. But there are elements of technology in that. Let us say in architecture, vaulting a vault.
Yeah.
Once it was solved, you could go on to new things like building cathedrals. You couldn't do that before.
Or building skyscrapers.
Or building skyscrapers. We are both, in a sense, historians, and we can hardly imagine what it would be like not to know anything about the past and to live entirely in the present. It seems to me a pity that some people try to do that because they are deprived of many beautiful experiences and much important knowledge to understand how the world has become what it is today, even if our knowledge is always conjectural.
I do agree, and it is impossible for anybody who has any interest in history not to see that our world, the world in which we now live in the Western countries, is really the best and most beautiful world which has so far existed. It is the justest world, the freest world, and the world fullest of opportunities. And in addition to all that, it is the world which has become most critical of itself. Of course, very many people fall into historicists and other ideologies and believe that we are living in a very bad world. As a matter of fact, in a way, there is a kind of religion that we live in a social hell. I think that is fantastic and completely mistaken, and anybody who knows any history can easily show that it is quite mistaken and that the world has never been as good as this before and as hopeful as this before. Of course, about the future we know nothing but that it is open, that it is not predetermined, and that it will depend on our efforts, whether it will be better or worse than it is now. It is we who are really making the future. And whether we can further progress, I don't know. there is no such a thing as progressivism, that is to say, a necessity to progress or anything of that. We can always also regress if we do not really work for betterment directly, not for progress, but for a better world.
Uncertain Truth returns next week at 11:45, when Sir Karl Popper will discuss the evolution of language.
First on 4, the philosopher Karl Popper explores the uncertain truth of language.
Now, today we have a really important discussion about the evolution of human language, and what is the main point of our discussion, I think, is to bring out what is specifically human and different from animal languages. Because, of course, the evolution of the human language is the evolution of man, in a way.
Yes.
Point which I am going to stress particularly is that in human language, like our discussion now, we are usually in a situation which is not particularly dangerous, and we don't refer usually to immediate dangerous situations. We speak, for example, as we do now, about abstract things like the human language or like the brain or whatever it may be. I mean, or we read a novel, or we go to the theater and see there a drama, a dramatic performance, which may give us the idea of danger, but which has nothing to do really with the danger.
I want immediately to go to the chimpanzee, who is our nearest living relative. And it's been studied in the Gombe Stream Reserve by Jane Goodall in a wonderful 20 or 30 year long dedicated work. So when she looks at chimpanzee behavior, how they talk or signal to each other, it's very simple in a way. They have many facial signals and signs. They get angry and they shout and wave their arms around without damaging them much. They wave sticks and branches and so on. The communication, though, is expression of emotions and in signaling in some way or other of what the other one should do. But they do work together, as a group with the bosses on top. But it's all organized by a complex system of signaling with sounds and gestures. And that is the kind of animal language that we came from as humans.
He pointed out that in all language there is something like self-expression. But he also stressed at once that this is really the lowest of the function which language has to perform. Self-expression is unavoidable. When I talk to you, I move my hand, and that is, of course, self-expression. But I also talk to you and wish to make a certain impression on you and wish to get a certain response for you. This is what Bühler calls the signal function of the language, the second function. And then the next function, which Bühler has indicated, is what he called the descriptive function. It is in the main to convey to you a definite information which you may use next year or next day or in the next moment, but where it is usually not very relevant at what moment, at what time you will use it. That is the characteristic situation of the descriptive function. Then, in addition to that, there is a quite different function again of language, namely the argumentative function, the fourth function, which is completely only human, only present in human discussion, and where we really can say this is what one calls human reason, that is behind it, reasoning and human reason. And these four functions show very clearly the immense step which we have made beyond the level of our animal predecessors, animal forefathers.
Most of the descriptions, that we give are often in response to a question. A child will ask about what happened there or what was going on at the railway station or whatever, and so he gets a description of it. So this is human interaction, but you don't get this with the chimpanzees even.
Now, I think perhaps one should consider what has come out of all of that. That is to say, the really paramount importance which language has for our lives and especially for our cultural life, for human culture. In our case, of course, since we are both writers and write books, language is actually almost identical with our life. We use language all the time in our work. But that is our very special situation.
I think language is at the basis of all culture, all human culture. Because without language, we know the cases which are deprived of language, they have a terrible struggle to become human. And you will tell us about Helen Keller.
Helen was deaf and blind, and therefore, since she was quite deaf, she couldn't speak, and since she was blind, she had actually very little knowledge of the outside world, although she could feel, and with her hands could walk and
by feeling and
was caressed by her parents and so on, but she was really hardly human. A teacher came to look after her, and this teacher did succeed in teaching her sign language,
writing
on the palm. And the astonishing story is that Helen, who became a great writer and actually even a speaker later, that Helen remembered very clearly when she wrote her story, the incredible experience of suddenly realizing the word which was written in her hand. The first word was water, when a stream of water fell on her hand.
Yes.
And the realization, this is water, this is something I can now myself express also by writing water on the hand of the teacher. It was a change in her life, and it was a change which made her human. Really rescued her from an animal stage and made her human. And she became later capable of writing. She wrote quite a lot, among other things, the story of her life, which in my opinion really everybody should read.
Yes. It's called The Story of My Life.
And this need for language was probably in her greater than perhaps in other children. Nevertheless, it shows what it really means, what language really means to us, and what language can really be for us.
Well, that's an extraordinary story, but of course we've all done this.
Yes.
Each of us was a baby without language, and we learnt it. And this is what any of you will know, anybody will know, how the young children, babies to children, how they talk so much and ask so much and practice so much. They even practice on their own, as Papashek has shown. So we have this incessant urge to develop language because we were born human with a human brain.
Now, I say, I have difficulty to show why I feel that this step is quite an almost impossible step. The gap to be bridged is so wide, from 2 to 3, from warning to description.
Yes.
Now, what is here really the point? The point is that we moved from something instinctive, which is still present when I speak with my hands, from something instinctive to something deliberate, something full of thought, something foreseeing, and to a state that is very important, where it is possible to lie. That is one of the interesting questions. We can say that a dancing bee indicating where the food is to the other bees, a dancing bee cannot lie. It can err, but it cannot lie. It can be misled by a scientist who is building up a whole apparatus to mislead the bee, but it cannot lie. We come to a place where we have the freedom to speak the truth or to tell a story which isn't true.
Yes, yes.
All that, I think, constitutes a very wide gap to be bridged in the evolution from warning cries to storytelling.
Yes.
Now, descriptive talk is not a perfected warning cry. That is one way to see it.
Yes.
By better and better and better warning cries, we never get away from a situation where there happens something, we react to it instinctively with the warning cry.
Yes.
That can reach all perfection, and it never gets to the relaxed telling of a story, perhaps lying, perhaps true. A new machinery in the brain is needed for this new step.
Yes.
And why is it needed? I have tried now to explain as good as I can. It isn't very good, by showing that it cannot be a process of perfection of a machinery which is already here. Yes, in my opinion, specifically human language fulfills an entirely new function, and for this new function, a new brain machinery is required.
I think that shows very fine insight into the real basis of harmonic evolution of the brain. It was not just the increase of the chimpanzee to the human of about 3.5 times bigger. More chimpanzee brain doesn't give you the opportunity for human speech. It only gives you more chimpanzee. It has to be something new came into the brain, a new development of the brain. And this development came in certain areas can be seen where language came, but also music and spatial relations. But more importantly, the frontal areas, here in the front of our brain. This is the really big human development, where you get all of the highest performances, the memories, the ideals, the creativity, the imagination, all of these great human qualities, which are all linguistic. They're all based upon language.
Young mammals learn by a kind of wild imitation of the old. I mean, I always like, especially young cats, when they rush about like wild and eat everything which they can get their teeth in, bite. That is all a kind of imitation of the more understandable behavior of the old cats. And it does these things in preparation for functions in, let us say, in the real life which comes later to the cat.
Yes.
And we can say that the same thing is characteristic of children. Now, I would propose that in play, in, let us say, play acting of the children, they use the warning cries in a playful way. And this is already removed from the instinctive use of the warning cry in the situation to which the warning cry fits, in the fitting situation. Let us take the cry wolf. The children would try to threaten each other with the cry wolf, and would set up a play where they would play as being afraid of the wolf, Who is Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?
Yes.
That is the game
Yes.
which the children play, and the cry wolf would play a role as a warning cry in that game. Now, this children's game, in a certain way, has already all those difficult properties which the descriptive language has compared with the
Signaling language.
signal function language. It is not something which refers to a real situation now, but only to an imagined situation which can just as well be played 5 minutes later or an hour later, and so on. It isn't really released by a real situation, but it is released by an imagined situation, and it has actually to do something even quite unconscious yet with planning, namely it is planning for the later serious wolf situation.
Can I break in for a moment? I think that what you're trying to say is this is a dramatic performance. It is a simple drama. Yeah. And in fact, in all drama, we're doing just that. All drama is putting on a description of something that did happen in the past that can be useful in the future, but full of meaning for us now.
Exactly. That is what I mean.
Yes.
There is something in our stage 3, in the descriptive language, which is similar to signal language as drama is related to the real drama of life.
Yes. The hazards of life.
So my hypothesis, of course, unfortunately untestable hypothesis, my hypothesis is that through children's playing was really, of course, slowly the transition made from the mere signal function of language to, let us say, the dramatic function of language, and through the dramatic function of language then we come to this, let us say, somewhat unreal way in which we may talk over the coffee table, or in this case a work table, which we can speak theoretical and perhaps quite relax about the gravest dangers in the world.
I think there is testing possible, because we have to always think that language came to each one of us, to each child, in a somewhat analogous way to the evolution of language in hominid evolution. Each child we can study, how did they learn to use language in a descriptive manner from just a signaling manner? Because a baby uses language only for signaling and for expression. And a child begins to use language for description and question. Yeah. And so I think you could study in detail that scientifically, the whole procedures of children. I'm sure that it's an important challenge.
Of course, we are all selves, and we all know what that means. But the baby isn't born as a self. Of course, it needs a long period for, let us say, waking up fully. And in this waking up process, as we have already said, both walking and language especially plays a very great role. Especially language for the consciousness that it is a self. comes to the baby more or less at the same time when it begins to refer to itself by speaking of itself as I.
Yes.
And only then has he realized that others are selves and that it is a self. This realization is obviously very closely connected.
The point is, it asks so many questions. It asks about its immediate happenings, the surrounds and the others, and so on. So this is the baby establishing itself as a self through language, question and description and argument.
Of course, especially with the asking of a question, it is clear that very much depends on the way in which it is loved, taken seriously, in which its questions are taken seriously and are answered in a way in which the child can feel that its question has been answered. And that is often a great task for the family, a very great difficulty, because the questions aren't easily answered. Questions go to the very bottom of the structure of our world.
Well, now on for Uncertain Truth, and in the last programme of the series, Sir Karl Popper and Lord Anthony Quinton discuss knowledge.
Our situation, if we don't know and want to obtain knowledge, can be compared with that of a black man in a dark room who looks for a black hat which may not be there. What can he do? He can only feel with his hands, perhaps with his feet. He operates by trial and error. I think that is the fundamental situation of any organism trying to get knowledge.
Well, Sir Karl, you've covered a great range of subjects in your writings over the years, but I think you'd probably agree that the basis of everything you've had to say in the wide array of philosophical topics you've treated is your views about knowledge. And these are of an original and radical character. And perhaps the best way of bringing out what's special about them is to contrast them with the conventional, more or less traditional view of knowledge.
People think usually that we acquire knowledge by opening our eyes and our ears and let the sensations stream into us. And they believe then that we record this like a camera. In my opinion, if we wish to get knowledge, we have to have a problem. It has to be knowledge of something. We have to find out something. We don't have to wait for information to stream into us, but we have to be inquisitive if we want to get knowledge. If we were passive, we would gain a confused mass of sensations or something like that, which we would hardly be able to understand and to convert into what one may call knowledge. Quite apart from that, perception is not really, in my opinion, the main source of our knowledge. The role of perception is to inform us about a momentary situation in our environment. But we couldn't really interpret our perceptions without knowing much more about our environment, namely, we know whether we are in a house or whether we are in a glacier. So we have two kinds of knowledge: this wider knowledge of a frame in which we orientate ourselves, and the momentary perception which gives us information about the situation at that particular moment. And it is only this situation in which we can use our perception. So we have theoretical knowledge and, if you like, the momentary practical challenge to our theoretical knowledge. And here comes perception in.
I suspect that some defenders of the traditional conception would say, well, we admit that there's activity, in that we admit that people have to attend, that one can easily fail to register masses of things that are in principle perceivable because of failure of attention. They would admit that in seeking knowledge of the world round us, we engage in more or less exploratory activity or manipulate things. And I think in particular they'd say, wherever we look around in the world, we're always ready to draw inferences of a certain kind from what we see, using our background knowledge. And so they would argue, perhaps, that they don't see that you're really correcting them by saying that the mind is active in the pursuit of knowledge.
You mentioned that traditionally it is said that the activity comes in because we draw inferences from our perceptions, let us say. But it is also at once said, yes, but with that there is the danger of error. So if you admit activity, you do admit our human erroneous moves. You admit human fallibility to come in. It was for this reason, I think, that the traditional theory stressed the passivity, that is to say, the datum. It spoke about sense data. Data means given. So we are given certain things, and that is not active, but there we are passive. We are given certain things, and as this given knowledge, this is to be taken as really certain, rock bottom. On this we can build. If we replace the given by our active intervention from the very beginning, our trying to solve problems from the very beginning, not passively waiting for what we are given, then the uncertainty comes in even according to the traditional view of knowledge.
The interesting question that seems to me to arise here is, why has it been thought that we can attain certainty, and in some sense should, that we aren't doing our bit, intellectually speaking, unless we've acquired it? And I think one reason is perhaps emotional. I don't know if you'd agree with this, that people find doubt an uncomfortable state of mind. It's like sitting on a twisted cushion that you need to straighten out to be comfortable, or like passing your desk and seeing an unanswered letter or an unpaid bill. A belief that's to some extent been rendered acceptable by your investigations but has not been rendered certain is a piece of uncompleted business, in that it's susceptible of further improvement.
In my logic of scientific discovery, I suggested that instead of building on rock bottom an edifice of knowledge, which then will be absolutely certain, what we have to do is to drive piles in a swamp sufficiently deep to carry the building, at least for some time, the building which we erect. This kind of metaphor also indicates that we drive down from above. That is to say, we have our theoretical knowledge. This theoretical knowledge has to have a certain priority. We come from up down. The black man who looks for a black hat in a dark room, and the black hat may not be there, he at least knows something, at least knows his problem of finding the black hat. That is the minimum he has to know, and this is theoretical knowledge which is prior to the empirical knowledge, the feeling of the hat for which he is seeking. The main instigation for the search of truth is really that we see new problems. The discovery of new problems can be more important than the solution of the problem. I think this is perhaps the most important thing in science, and is the result of an attitude which does not go for certainty, but goes for where we fail, for the uncertainty. There are the problems where we do not find satisfaction, certainty. There we should go on digging.
All right, so you abandon certainty as an object because, in effect, it's a block. It's the idea that you can achieve certainty obstructs what the mind ought to be doing, pursuing ever deeper into the knowabilities of the world, but without any assumption that it'll ever finally conclude its search. Fine. But it's all very well to say the alternative is the search for truth, but to know that we're doing this more or less right, that we're pushing in the right direction in this search, don't we have to have some alternative to certainty, something in the nature of truth-likeness, probability, confirmation, support, justification, all ideas about which you've been very critical? Don't we need something like that to show us that we're pointed in the right direction?
We have to replace it by the search for truth in the form of criticism. We have constantly to criticize our own theories, our own interpretations. And criticism of this kind, which I have in mind, could be called rational criticism, because it is criticism of our own theories in the interest of truth. It must be unpersonal, completely impersonal criticism. It is criticism which asks itself, have we not made a mistake? Have we not overlooked something? Can we not find fault in what we have thought, interpreted, constructed, or whatever? It is criticism, as it were, from inside, in the sense that it is a criticism directed to improving our knowledge. The knowledge which we have may be faulty and therefore should be improved through criticism. One can compare this to the following. The search for certainty is like erecting a wall round your castle and build the wall higher and higher and higher. It will never be quite high enough to establish certainty. So we have to buy a watchdog. Then we don't need such a high wall, and the watchdog looks from inside. That is this internal criticism which I have in mind. Once we realize that our theories cannot be certain, nothing helps but self-criticism in this impersonal sense. It is the only thing by which we can improve our theories, get them nearer to the truth.
The trouble with self-criticism of the Crusoian kind, if I may put it like that, rather than the kind which is undertaken at the behest of the political police, is that it's like trying to tickle yourself. It just doesn't work. Or perhaps even trying to hit yourself over the head with a hammer. It doesn't work very well. And an invincible affection prevents one putting any real force behind the blow. In other words, in general, genuinely intellectual self-criticism often fails because the critic and the criticized are one and the same. Well, an implication of that, of course, that science can't be an activity conducted by a Robinson Crusoe without effective criticism, is that science is a social institution. And in your later writings, you develop this a good deal into the idea of the theory of objective knowledge, that as well as the knowledge that's in some sense or other contained in the brains or minds of individual knowers, there is common knowledge which to some extent contains or overlaps that individual knowledge, but to a considerable extent goes beyond it.
Now, what I want to illustrate is the distinction between two kinds of knowledge. The knowledge, let us say, I know, and the knowledge, it is known. This I know is knowledge in the subjective sense, and it is known is knowledge in the objective sense. I want to stress that the basic knowledge is, of course, subjective knowledge, knowledge which is known to people. I will, however, show how far you can build beyond this basic knowledge and how incredibly important knowledge in the objective sense has become, especially since the invention of language, of writing, of printing, and everything which follows up to this. Logarithms, books of logarithms. These can be computed, and a computer can be made to print out a book of logarithms. Of course, somebody has to have the subjective knowledge needed for instructing the computer who will compose these logarithms. But the actual logarithms will be known only by the people who use them. And it is unlikely that they will be ever used more than a minute fraction of what is in a full book of logarithm, let us say, up to 7 decimals. It would be a library needed for keeping them. So there will be objective knowledge not used, not known to anybody. Now, theories are important for our lives in a sense in which it is rarely realized. Think of all that which is involved in a flight from, let us say, London to Edinburgh. No single person can have the knowledge in his head which actually enters here into this question of safety. And it is a lot of knowledge, of subjective knowledge, which is here related. But the subjective knowledge is insufficient. None of the subjective knowledges in the various people's head suffices. And something is there which nobody has in his head, namely the way in which all this is interlinked. This is built up by an organization, and this organization is objective and impersonal, although it has been developed during many years by mainly the correction of mistakes which we have made. Now, in this sense, the realm of objective knowledge is great, very important. The best example still is libraries. And the interesting thing is that the philosophers who have dealt with the theory of knowledge have overlooked this. They all thought of knowledge in the certain primary subjective sense in which people are there and act on the basis of what they remember, what they know. Hardly anybody has seen that the product of our thinking, which are very largely expectations, theories, especially theories, that the product of our thinking is really a kind of knowledge which just as well has the right to be called knowledge and is called by us always knowledge. We speak of scientific knowledge, meaning, of course, objective knowledge, so that the product of our thinking becomes impersonal.
There's a remark of Burke's which comes to mind here, something like, the individual is foolish, but the species is wise. That perhaps doesn't want to be taken too literally, since if the species is to become wise, it becomes wise through the intellectual enterprise of particular individuals within it. But it seems to me a moral is that the individual can only make intellectual progress by utilizing the accumulated tradition of knowledge and procedures for acquiring knowledge, which constitute the system of objective knowledge. But there's one particular thing you go on to say about objective knowledge, where you say it's best understood in an evolutionary perspective that it's something that's evolved in a more or less Darwinian way by selective preservation of some favourable elements and the competitive exclusion of undesirable elements. Now, what actually do you see as the significance of this comparison? Or perhaps it's more than a comparison. Perhaps it's a theory itself.
Yes, there is indeed a theory. It is called evolutionary theory of knowledge, which plays now a considerable role in biology, namely in evolutionary biology, especially since the last great developments in genetics. And this theory is really an application of the trial and error theory, the theory of that we learn by trial and error elimination. We learn from our mistakes. One can say that from the amoeba to Einstein there is only one step. Both learn by trial and error and the elimination of error. The main difference is that Einstein is intensely self-critical, which the amoeba is not. Einstein develops his theories and throws them into the waste paper basket many times before he comes to the theory which he would perhaps publish. The new way of looking at these things is really that life from the beginning is problem solving by this method of trial and error elimination. And this holds both for the individual organism and for the species and the evolution of the species.